Here we go, Monday, and if it's Monday, it's gonna be Monday Mastery. I did a bit of looking only just study options and decided to start with the basics with some pawn and game practice because I had a comment the other day saying how overlooked pawn endgames are, and I have to agree. All these endgames come with some explanation, but I thought I would give also my knowledge and explanation. The person who created this study says this is a one endgame for white. The black king can't arrive to catch the passed pawn because he isn't in the square and he can't enter to the square. He says that this is a lost endgame for black because the black king is outside of the square. And what they mean is that if you go, so well, this would be a square here. If you draw a square, and here we go, that's basically a square. But you don't have to always like kind of imagine a square. You can always also imagine just from the pawn going out diagonally a line. White will move, and already the black king is outside of that imaginary square. So if white moves first, white will move, of course, 2 squares ahead because the pawn can move 2 ahead as long as it's on the starting line. And now they drew this lovely square for you. I feel like this square should last here. So it's not drawn well because the square should be until here. There we go. That's a square. The other one is a rectangle, but never mind. The king is too far away. Now the king starts to come to catch the pawn. But you see now they drew the square properly, but the pawn is way ahead. So the king is not gonna catch it. And the pawn is gonna turn into a queen. And that's it. That's the first lesson. Pawn endgame 2. So this case, you see that that's the square here, and the black king is way closer. So even though white starts, white will be here, the square, and the king is within the square. What happens then? The king is gonna definitely reach that pawn, right? And that's a draw. So there can be so much at stake with the pawn endgames, and the whole basic idea is watch out where your king is in comparison to the pawn. These are pretty easy, but let's get going to pawn endgame 3. So that's another basic idea, and an important one is that they say this endgame is won for white because we only have to progress with the pawn, always with the king in front of the pawn. I feel like this description is a bit, this endgame is won because we can reach the critical squares. So you will see the critical squares. So this pawn is heading this way, right? And the critical squares with the king will be to support that pawn are these here. With the king, we will have to be next to the pawn to be able to enter. Black has to move, so black moves up, and now we have these 3 options to move. What we need to try in this case is keep opposition. So opposition means when the 2 kings are opposite of each other. There is one spot in between. They say it's when one king is 1 square in front of the other, and it's usually favorable for the player which doesn't move. When the king moves out, white can move to the other side to help this pawn forward. And if king came up here, then we would do check again, and then we are just helping in the pawn. So the king has to stay behind the pawn, black king. So they went down, and we do opposition again. And then king moves out, we come to the side, and now we can start to come with the pawn. Because we already reached this critical point here with the king, so we can just get the pawn in. Instead of that, could the king not just move down to the critical point, but it would be way too soon because the king can come up here. Instead, you come forward with the pawn, and now the king goes down trying to achieve so I don't move onto the critical points. But here we have the option to go opposite. At the beginning, when they said this endgame is won for white because we only have to progress with the pawn, always with the king in front of the pawn, we win a tempo with our pawn. So opposition, now the king has to move out and we come down and just help, as shown on the arrows, we help in the pawn. The promotion can be stopped now, that's right. And that's the end. Weird. Okay, let's not confuse ourselves. We really need to get a mouse because it's hard without the mouse.